I could make a whole video off of just Antonio Maceo and the Cuban Revolution. That's what's jumping in. I think that they had dark ones. This is one of them, what is it called? Renaissance Emperor. Antonio Maceo. He was a mulatto man who basically helped Cuba fight for their independence. Oh, I'm gonna hurt myself, man. Yeah, so back in 1867 was the last African, or the last slave ship to enter into Cuba straight from Africa. All right, Cuba, unlike many of the other Caribbean islands, actually had an expansive slave trade from 1800 to about the 1860s. So a lot of their African population was very new, very recent to the island at this time. But what ended up happening was you had two classes of whites in Cuba. You had the class of whites that had old money, most of whom lived on the eastern part of Cuba, and you had the classes of whites that had new money. Those were the ones that were pretty much expanding out westward, that were going out farther and farther west, and they profited a lot off of the transatlantic slave trade. The ones that had the old money that lived on the eastern part of the island were pretty much done with the whole slave trade thing. They were sitting on a lot of money. They didn't really engage in the slave trade so much. What they preferred more than expansive slavery was independence from Spain. Most of the Spanish colonies in the Americas had received their independence between the 1820s and 1850s due to the Napoleonic Wars that were going on in Europe. Spanish countries, Spain couldn't hold on to the colonies much any longer, so a lot of those countries got their independence. The only reason why Cuba decided to remain under the Spanish crown is because of the fact they were expanding slavery so much. And they wanted protection, just in case there was a slave revolt similar to Haiti. So that slave revolt would become a reality eventually. As a matter of fact, what ended up happening was in the 1860s, that old money population of whites decided to free their slaves and engage in a revolution against Spain. All right, they called this a 10 Years' War. It lasted from 1868 to 1878. From 1868 to 1878, they ended up fighting tooth and nail for their freedom, the blacks and the whites fighting against the Spanish colonial government, but this war actually failed. By this point, you had guys like Antonio Maceo who had gotten involved in this revolutionary war. There was a war between 1879 and 1880, same thing, blacks and whites unified together, with Jose Marti and his artistic fervor started to come together and talk about this rainbow coalition of a revolution, this united front to fight against the Spanish colonials for their freedom from Spain. These blacks and whites came together and they fought. People like Antonio Maceo became a leading general in this fight. And this war also failed. Even though this war was blacker than the first one, and it was very much so a slave revolt as well as a war for independence, this war also failed. So the Spanish got clever. They said, you know what? These blacks and whites are collaborating together. Let's find a way to separate the blacks from the whites. So the Spanish said in 1881, we're gonna have a gradual abolition law that gradually will emancipate Africans in the island from slavery. Hopefully they won't side with the whites and for a war of independence. This gradual abolition law turned into the absolute abolition of slavery by 1886, right? So then, fast forward a little bit to 1895, this didn't stop the blacks and the whites in the island from uniting. And they did. People like Jose Marti would publish literature talking about blacks and whites uniting against the Spanish, and they eventually did. 1895 to 1898, there was the third war of independence when Antonio Maceo fought tooth and nail for this freedom from Spain. But something happened in 1898. You know what that is? There was a ship, American ship, that was sailing in the harbor of Havana, that somehow, some way, just exploded. Boom! Blew up. Now the Americans, they blamed it on the Spanish. So Americans like to blame things on people to be able to get involved in conflicts. So the Americans decided, we're going to get involved in this war. We're going to blame the explosion of our USS Maine on the Spanish to give us the excuse to get involved in the war, fighting on the sides of the revolutionaries against Spain. And that way, at the end of this war, we will have a seat at the table when it comes to the negotiations, when it comes to the treaties that are going to be signed. In other words, we will liberate the Cubans, even though those Cubans were already on the way to liberating themselves. They were well on their way to winning this war against Spain. And the Johnny-come-latelys step in, the United States, and they get involved, and they have a seat at the table. One thing that happened was when Theodore Roosevelt and all these guys came in, the Rough Riders and all that, they said, oh my gosh, I didn't know how black this revolution was. So they decided to segregate the Cuban military, demote all black officers, and then make this a white revolution against Spain. And after 1902, they signed what was known as the Platt Amendment. The United States pretty much at that point was at the seat signing treaties and all that kind of stuff. And as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States got at other Spanish colonies, such as the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. But officially, they weren't supposed to get Cuba because of the Teller Amendment. The Congress said the only way we'll allow you guys to go and invade Cuba is if you guys promise that you're not going to take Cuba officially as your own. But even though they didn't take Cuba officially as their own, the Platt Amendment basically made Cuba a part of the United States and allowed the United States to intervene in all Cuban affairs whenever they wanted to. It allowed the United States to segregate Cuba. It allowed the United States to basically impose Jim Crow laws that were happening 90 miles north of this place in Cuba. And the reason why they got involved in this in the first place, because I believe that ship was not exploded due to any kind of Spanish attack. I believe the U.S. blew up its own ship to give themselves the justification for getting involved in this war, because they did not want another black country to receive independence, especially 90 miles to the south of the Jim Crow United States. Haiti was the only other independent country in the Western Hemisphere, black country that is. And you see what they did to them, all right? So as a matter of fact, in the world, there was no such thing as a legitimate black country. All you had was Ethiopia, Liberia, and Haiti. Every other black country in the world was colonized by a European. So Cuba would have been the fourth independent black country, legitimate black country, modern black country. And they said, that's too close to the United States. We can't have that. Let's blow up our own ship. Boom! Right there, harbor of Havana. So, so this statue was erected, I believe, somewhere around 1921 or something like that. And I don't quote me on this. But the only reason why they erected this statue was because they had this political party, this revolutionary party, after the United States came in and started disrupting everything and decided to segregate everything. The black veterans of the Cuban Revolution felt left out. So they formed their own party called the PIC. I think it was Partido Independiente de Color, something like that. This party decided we deserve our benefits as veterans. We deserve to get all of our rights. We deserve all those things. So they started to protest. And a lot of blacks in Santiago de Cuba started to rise up. Well, the United States sent in their military. They invaded in 1917. And then they killed, I think it was 5,000 black Cubans or more. And in this process. But because they didn't want too much backlash and everything like that, they decided after a couple of years of killing 5,000 black Cubans with the assistance of the United States, they decided to erect a statue representing a black man, a black revolutionary. And in closing, that whole entire late 19th century, early 20th century, the Cuban white government that was now basically a puppet government of the United States, they started to bring in white Europeans from Europe to dilute the black population here in Cuba. They call it a system of blancamiento. Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, you name it, started coming here in large numbers. But black don't crack. I'm just kidding. All right, that's it.